Welcome to the Douglas Caddy Show. I'm Douglas Caddy, and I'm pleased to have as my guest today Ray Hill. One of the topics we're going to be covering in our show on a regular basis is the administration of justice, all the way from arrest and arraignment to conviction and incarceration. And today we're going to focus on the case of one individual who's been incarcerated in the Texas prison system for 17 years, although he's only 34 years old. He's been in prison since he was 17 years old. His name is John Bice, and Ray Hill knows a great deal about this case. But let me first tell you a little about Ray Hill. Ray Hill has an distinguished record. If I were to enumerate all his accomplishments, we'd be here all day. But I'm just going to single out three. He's been the moderator of the Prison Show for over 27 years. That's an award-winning show broadcast by Pacifica Station here in Houston and also on the internet worldwide. He has received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Texas American Civil Liberties Union. And I won't say foremost because he's done so many other things. He won a case that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court called Hill versus the City of Houston, and an arrest case, a freedom of speech case that we'll cover in another program at another time because of its great significance. But today we're going to focus on John Bice. John Bice is an extraordinary young man. As I mentioned earlier, he's been incarcerated for 17 years in the prison system of Texas. And Ray Hill has been familiar with this case since its inception. So Ray, would you please explain to us how this case arose?
Well, John's very important to me. John and I are very dear friends, and we became that after he went to prison. I am responsible for the investigation that resulted in identifying John, prosecuting him, and sending him to prison. On the night of 4th of July, or the early morning hours of 4th of July, 1991, gay banker Paul Broussard was gay-bashed, stabbed on a Houston street, and they called me at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the complaint was that the city of Houston wouldn't transport the injured person, the EMTs wouldn't. And so I called the dispatcher and asked him to meet me there, and I went to the scene. When I got to the scene, after my call to the dispatcher, they of course transported Paul. Paul was conversational, lucid. When he left the scene, he was dead by 9 o'clock in the morning. And the detective that was there said, no, we ain't going to solve this old case. This is one of them assailants unknown cases. We're not going to solve it. And he wasn't doing anything to protect the evidence.
This was a veteran Houston Police Department
veteran
detective?
Houston homicide detective.
Homicide detective.
And so I went to the police chief because at 9 o'clock the next morning I learned that Paul Broussard had died. We are not talking about an assault now. We're talking about a homicide, which is an altogether more serious matter.
Very serious.
And so I went to the police chief and I said, I want better detectives on this case. And Sam Nuccia, who was the police chief at the time, gave me what I believe to be the best that he had, Detective Avadondolo and Detective Vacaris. And they looked at all the available evidence and talked to the other people there and came back with City of Houston had nothing to investigate. And that infuriated me because that happens very often in violence against gay people. The police claim, well, we can't solve this case. And I get upset with that because I hear it too often. And so I decided it was my responsibility to solve it. And the only tool that I had was the media. So I generated a great deal of media, and ultimately someone came forward with some information. And one of the assailants, Derek Attard, was identified. He was by that time in New York. When he was being extradited back to Texas, he revealed the names of his co-conspirators.
Where did these, there were more than one obviously, where did they come from?
There were 10, and I coined the phrase Woodland's 10 because in Houston, Texas, Woodland is an upscale neighborhood of professionals, and I did that on purpose for media advantages.
What age?
Spoiled, rich kids. They were all students except one at McCullough High School.
High school.
They were, the oldest was 20, and the youngest was 17. They were all adults under the law, but they were just kids, really.
How many out of the 10 were actually involved in the fracas or the incident?
Well, I mean, I gave a rule from the beginning that everybody that touched Paul Broussard was going to prison except the informant, Derek Attard. And in the criminal justice business, that's the way you do it. You reward somebody for being an informant, because it takes a lot of guts to rat on your friends. And so he got probation, and 4 others got probation. 5 went directly to prison for being involved in the assault of Paul Broussard. 4 were along for the ride, and then there was the informant. Of the 5 that got probation, 2, including the informant, would violate their probation, go to prison. So a total of 7 went to prison, and 3 successfully survived their probation.
And how many are still in prison?
1.
Just 1?
Well, 1 is back in. There are 2 locked up today, but 1 has been out and violated his parole and is back in, and I accept no responsibility for not keeping your conditions of parole.
Right.
But there's 1 on my ticket, and that's John Bice. He's in prison, and I'm responsible for identifying and seeing to him that he went there.
Why is he still incarcerated at this point?
Well, he was the guy with the knife, and Paul Broussard, according to the autopsy report, bled to death. And so it was assumed that he was the cause of death. I have another theory about that, but certainly it traced him. When he got 45 years, he was the first one sentenced. I thought at the time that was too severe of a sentence.
My understanding, he didn't even contest the charges. He pleaded guilty. Is that right? Or?
Under advice of his counsel, he pleaded guilty to a 45-year sentence, which was an unreasonable amount for a 17-year-old kid who got stoned and stupid.
Right. Well, how has he conducted himself in prison? Has he been?
Well, I taught him how to do prison.
Okay.
As things happen, this was a gay bash killing. Mm-hmm. I built it as that in the media, and so it occurred to me that we're going to send originally 5 of those people, later 2 others, to Texas prison, which is one of the most homophobic places in the world, far more homophobic than McCullough High School. So you send mad dogs into prison, you get rattlesnakes back if somebody doesn't break the pattern. I mean, you go to prison for killing gay people in Texas in the early 1990s, you become a class hero. I mean, you're doing what others around you would have done given the same circumstances. And so you've got to ameliorate that somehow, and whose responsibility is that? Well, in addition to being the gay rights guy, I'm also the prison activist guy, and so I assumed that that was my responsibility. So I forced John and others to correspond with me. I went on my radio show, which you call the Prison Show, and it had been running then for almost 10 years when this happened, and so it had a wide reputation in Texas prisons. And I said, I want this John Bice guy to write me. And so people who listened to my show went to John and said, we got a friend out there that wants to correspond with you. And he said, who's that? And he said, Ray Hill. And he said, that mother sent me to prison. Why the hell would I want to write him?
Right.
And my friends in prison, my audience in prison persisted, and I got a what the hell do you want letter, and I did not respond to it as he anticipated. I wrote him back and said, son, you got 45 years. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know what kind of hell you've gotten yourself into. I happen to know how to survive Texas prison. I went down with a big number myself, and I'm willing to help you and your family do this time.